In the winter of 1944, Luftwaffe ace Werner Hoffmann shot down his 23rd Allied bomber over the skies of Brandenburg. He returned to base confident, victorious, certain that German engineering and pilot superiority would carry the Reich through another year of war. 3 months later, he would be dead, his Messerschmitt torn apart by a fighter he had been taught to dismiss as inferior. The P-51 Mustang wasn't supposed to win. American pilots flying these long-range escorts were entering combat against men who had been fighting since Poland, since France, since the first days of the Blitz. Yet by the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had been shattered not by numbers alone, but by a machine that changed every assumption about air superiority. The gun camera footage tells a story the history books barely whisper. 6 Browning M2 machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, could deliver 800 rounds per minute per gun. When all 6 opened up together, they didn't just damage enemy aircraft. They disintegrated them. German pilots called them the Himmelsjäger, the Sky Hunters, and they learned too late that altitude, experience, and courage meant nothing when those guns found their mark. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain James Robert Dalton had been flying combat missions for 11 months when he first saw what the Mustang could really do. He was 24 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had learned to fly crop dusters before the war and had somehow survived long enough to lead a flight of 4 P-51DS out of RAF Bodney in East Anglia. His wingman that day was Lieutenant Peter Callahan, a wiry kid from Boston who talked too much and flew like he had something to prove. They were escorting a formation of B-17s deep into Germany, somewhere over the Ruhr Valley, when the call came over the radio. Bandits, high and closing fast. Dalton spotted them first. A staffel of Focke-Wulf 190s, maybe a dozen strong, diving out of the sun with the kind of precision that only veteran pilots could manage. The German formation split cleanly, half peeling off to hit the bombers from above while the rest came straight at the Mustang screen. Dalton pushed the throttle forward and felt the Merlin engine roar beneath him, the airframe trembling as the fighter surged ahead. He had flown P-40s in training and P-47 Thunderbolts on his first few missions, but nothing compared to the Mustang. It was faster, lighter, more responsive. It felt alive in his hands. The first Focke-Wulf came at him head-on, a tactic the Germans loved because it closed the distance fast and tested nerve. Dalton held his course, his thumb hovering over the gun button on the control stick. At 600 yards, he saw the flicker of muzzle flashes from the Germans' nose cannons. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. The Mustang shuddered as all 6 guns opened fire, the sound like thunder trapped inside a tin can. Tracer rounds arced out ahead of him, a stream of orange and white cutting through the cold air. He saw the impacts immediately. The Focke-Wulf's engine cowling erupted in a spray of metal fragments, pieces of the propeller spinning away like shrapnel. The German fighter didn't explode. It simply came apart, the fuselage tearing open as if an invisible hand had ripped it down the center. Dalton pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the wreckage tumbled past beneath him. He had no time to think about what he had just seen. 2 more German fighters were already turning toward him, their wings flashing in the winter sunlight. He rolled left, diving to pick up speed, and Callahan's voice crackled over the radio. He had one on his tail, and he was asking for help. Dalton didn't answer. He just turned, harder than the Mustang wanted to go, the wings groaning under the strain, and came up behind the German chasing Callahan. The range was close, maybe 200 yards, and when he fired again, the effect was devastating. The rounds walked up the fuselage of the Messerschmitt 109, punching through the thin aluminum skin and into the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The fighter nosed over and began to spin, trailing smoke and pieces of fabric. Callahan whooped over the radio, but Dalton was already scanning the sky for the next threat. The bombers were taking hits. He could see black puffs of flak bursting around them and at least 2 B-17s trailing smoke as they struggled to hold formation. The rest of the German fighters had broken through the escort screen and were making firing passes from above, their cannon shells ripping through wings and fuselages. Dalton called for his flight to regroup, but only 2 other Mustangs answered. The 4th was gone, either shot down or separated in the chaos. They climbed hard, pushing the Merlins to their limits, trying to get above the Germans before they could make another pass. The Mustang's rate of climb was good, better than the Thunderbolt, but the Focke-Wulfs had the advantage of altitude and speed. One of them came down in a steep dive, aiming for the lead bomber, and Dalton cut him off with a long deflection shot. He didn't think he hit anything vital, but the German broke off his attack and turned east, trailing a thin line of white vapor. It was enough. By the time the bombers reached the initial point and began their bombing run, most of the German fighters had disengaged. They were low on fuel or ammunition, and the appearance of more American escorts from another group convinced them to withdraw. Dalton circled above the formation, watching the bombs fall away in neat sticks, and felt the adrenaline begin to fade. His hands were shaking on the stick. His mouth was dry. When they finally turned for home, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen fields below. Back at Bodny, the ground crews swarmed over the Mustangs as soon as they rolled to a stop. Dalton climbed out of the cockpit, his legs unsteady, and stood for a moment just looking at his aircraft. The paint was scorched along the nose where the guns had been firing. The smell of cordite and burnt oil hung in the cold air. An armorer came over and counted the spent casings piled in the bottom of the gun bays. Nearly 1,800 rounds fired in less than 10 minutes. The armorer whistled and shook his head. He said that Dalton must have hit something good because the barrels were still hot. That night in the officers' club, Callahan kept replaying the mission in his head, talking through every turn and every shot. Dalton let him talk. He was thinking about the first German fighter, the way it had simply disintegrated under the weight of fire. He had seen planes shot down before. He had seen them catch fire or break apart after taking a direct hit from flak. But this was different. The Mustang's guns didn't just damage the enemy. They destroyed them with a finality that left no room for recovery or escape. The intelligence officer came by later with gun camera film from 3 of the 4 Mustangs. He set up a small projector in the corner of the room and ran the footage on a white sheet tacked to the wall. The other pilots gathered around, drinks in hand, watching the grainy black and white images flicker across the makeshift screen. There was Dalton's first kill, the head-on pass. The Focke-Wulf filled the frame for just a moment before the tracers tore into it. You could see the engine explode, pieces of the cowling flying back toward the camera. Then the fighter was gone, tumbling out of the frame. Someone in the back of the room let out a low whistle. Another pilot said something about overkill, but he was smiling when he said it. The footage from Callahan's camera showed a different angle. He had been chasing a Messerschmitt in a shallow dive when Dalton came in from the side and fired a long burst. The rounds hit the German fighter just behind the cockpit, and the entire tail section folded upward as if hinged. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. The plane went into a flat spin and disappeared beneath the clouds. Callahan paused the projector and pointed at the screen. He said that was the cleanest kill he had ever seen. Dalton didn't say anything. He finished his drink and left the club early, walking back to his barracks through the cold English night. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated. The 8th Air Force was flying deeper into Germany, hitting targets in Berlin, Munich, and the industrial centers of the Ruhr. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had, throwing up entire wings of fighters to intercept the bomber streams. The Mustangs met them head-on, and the results were almost always the same. German pilots who had survived years of combat found themselves outmatched not just by numbers but by firepower. The 650s on a Mustang could put more lead into the air in 10 seconds than most German fighters carried in their entire ammunition load. When those guns connected, the damage was catastrophic. Dalton's kill count climbed steadily. 5 confirmed by the end of February. 7 by mid-March. The other pilots in the squadron started calling him lucky, though he never felt lucky. He felt exhausted. Every mission was a gamble, every engagement a test of reflexes and nerve. He had seen too many good pilots go down, their Mustangs trailing fire or simply disappearing in a cloud of debris. He had heard too many final transmissions, voices calm or panicked or silent as they fell toward the earth below. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ground crews worked around the clock to keep the fighters airworthy. They patched bullet holes, replaced damaged engines, and reloaded the guns with fresh belts of ammunition. The Browning M2s were reliable, but they needed constant maintenance. The barrels wore out after prolonged firing, and the feed mechanisms could jam if the belts weren't loaded correctly. The armorers took pride in their work, and they made sure that every gun on every Mustang was test-fired before a mission. They knew that a malfunction at 25,000 feet could mean the difference between life and death. One afternoon in late March, Dalton was called to a briefing with the group commander. He walked into the operations building expecting another mission assignment, but instead he found a room full of intelligence officers and a table covered with reconnaissance photos. The commander, a colonel named Harrison who had flown bombers over France in the First War, motioned for him to sit down. He said they had a problem. The Germans were moving their best fighter units east to counter the Soviet advance, but they were leaving behind a corps of experienced pilots to defend the Reich. These men knew the tactics. They knew the weaknesses of the American formations. And they were getting better at avoiding the Mustang escorts. Harrison spread out a series of photos showing German airfields in southern Germany. He pointed to clusters of aircraft parked in revetments, covered with camouflage netting. He said intelligence estimated at least 200 fighters based in the area, a mix of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, with a handful of the new jet-powered Me-262s. The jets were fast, too fast for the Mustangs to catch in level flight, and their 30mm cannons could tear a bomber apart with just a few hits. The problem was that the jets needed long, smooth runways to take off and land, and those runways made them vulnerable. Harrison looked directly at Dalton and asked if he thought a low-level strafing mission could work. Dalton hesitated. Strafing was dangerous. It meant flying low and slow over enemy airfields, exposed to anti-aircraft fire from every direction. But it was also effective. A Mustang with full ammunition could destroy half a dozen parked aircraft in a single pass if the pilot had the nerve to press the attack. Dalton said it could work, but they would need perfect timing and a lot of luck. Harrison nodded and told him to start planning. The mission was scheduled for early April. Dalton would lead a flight of 8 Mustangs on a sweep through southern Bavaria, hitting 3 airfields in succession. They would fly in low, under the radar, and catch the Germans on the ground before they could scramble. The element of surprise was critical. If the Luftwaffe got even a few fighters into the air, the whole mission could turn into a bloodbath. Dalton spent the next 2 days studying maps and reconnaissance photos, memorizing landmarks and plotting approach vectors. He briefed his pilots on the plan, going over every detail until they could recite it in their sleep. The morning of the mission dawned clear and cold. Dalton climbed into his Mustang before sunrise, the air so still he could hear the distant rumble of bombers taking off from other bases. His crew chief, a stocky sergeant from Pennsylvania named O'Reilly, helped him strap in and ran through the final checks. O'Reilly said the guns were loaded hot, all 6 of them, with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. He patted the side of the fuselage and told Dalton to bring her back in one piece. Dalton nodded and closed the canopy. They took off in pairs, climbing to 10,000 feet before turning southeast toward Germany. The flight was uneventful at first. They crossed the channel and flew over the frozen patchwork of French farmland, then entered German airspace near the Rhine. Dalton kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for enemy fighters, but the sky was empty. The Germans were conserving fuel, waiting for the bombers to come to them. That was exactly what Dalton was counting on. As they approached the first target, Dalton ordered the flight to descend. They dropped to 500 feet, skimming over treetops and church steeples, following a narrow valley that would bring them in behind the airfield. The landscape blurred beneath them, a smear of brown and white and gray. Dalton's heart was pounding now, the adrenaline sharp and electric in his veins. He could see the airfield ahead, a long strip of concrete surrounded by woods. There were aircraft parked along the edge of the runway, at least a dozen of them, their wings folded and engines cold. Dalton didn't hesitate. He pushed the nose down and opened fire. The 6 Brownings roared to life, the tracers streaking out ahead of him in a deadly converging cone. The first fighter he hit was a Messerschmitt 109, and it exploded instantly, the fuel tanks igniting in a ball of orange flame. He walked his fire across the line of parked aircraft, each burst lasting only a second or two, but it was enough. Wings crumpled. Fuselages tore open. One fighter flipped onto its back as the rounds shredded its landing gear. Another simply disintegrated, pieces of it scattering across the tarmac like confetti. The other Mustangs followed in trail, each one firing as they passed over the airfield. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. A few anti-aircraft guns opened up, their tracers arcing lazily into the sky, but they were too slow. By the time they found the range, the Mustangs were already gone, climbing hard and turning toward the next target. Dalton glanced back over his shoulder and saw thick black smoke rising from the airfield, at least 8 or 9 fires burning out of control. The second airfield was more heavily defended. As they made their approach, Dalton saw flak bursts ahead, ugly black puffs that hung in the air like angry clouds. He called for the flight to spread out and come in from different angles. It was riskier, but it would divide the enemy fire. He went in first, dropping to 200 feet, his Mustang shaking from the turbulence kicked up by the explosions. The airfield came into view, and he saw more fighters parked in revetments, protected by earthen berms. He lined up on the nearest one and fired. The rounds tore through the camouflage netting and into the aircraft beneath. He saw the wings buckle and the propeller snap off and tumble across the ground. Then something hit his Mustang. There was a loud bang and the stick jerked in his hand. He looked down and saw a hole the size of a fist in the left wing, just outboard of the gun bay. Hydraulic fluid was streaming out, leaving a thin trail in the air behind him. He checked his instruments. The engine was still running smooth, and the controls responded, but he knew he had been hit hard. He pulled up and called for the flight to abort the third target. They had done enough damage. It was time to go home. The flight back across Germany was tense. Dalton nursed the wounded Mustang, keeping the speed down to reduce the strain on the damaged wing. Callahan flew close beside him, watching for any sign of trouble. They crossed the Rhine without incident and were over France when Dalton noticed the fuel gauge dropping faster than it should. The flak hit must have nicked one of the fuel lines. He did the math in his head and realized he wasn't going to make it back to Bodny. He would be lucky to reach the coast. He radioed ahead and requested an emergency landing at the nearest Allied airfield. The controller gave him a heading for a small fighter strip near Calais, a rough field used mostly for resupply flights. Dalton coaxed the Mustang down through the clouds and saw the runway ahead, a narrow strip of packed earth surrounded by tents and parked trucks. He lowered the gear and felt the left main wheel refuse to lock. The hydraulic system was shot. He had no choice but to bring it in on one wheel and the belly. The landing was controlled chaos. Dalton held the right wing up as long as he could, letting the Mustang settle onto the single gear before the left wing dropped and hit the ground. Metal screeched against earth. Sparks flew. The fighter skidded sideways, plowing a furrow through the mud, before finally coming to rest at the edge of the runway. Dalton shut down the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, his hands still gripping the stick. Then he popped the canopy and climbed out, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. The ground crew ran over, pulling him away from the aircraft in case it caught fire. But the Mustang just sat there, battered and scarred, leaking fluids onto the French mud. One of the crew chiefs walked around it, shaking his head in disbelief. He said Dalton was the luckiest man alive. Dalton didn't feel lucky. He felt tired. He sat down on the wet grass and watched as they towed the Mustang away, wondering how many more times he could roll the dice before his luck ran out. He hitched a ride back to Bodny on a cargo plane the next morning. When he arrived, O'Reilly was waiting for him on the flight line, hands on his hips, looking annoyed. He said they had brought Dalton's Mustang back on a flatbed truck, and it would take at least a week to repair. In the meantime, Dalton would be flying a replacement aircraft, a factory-fresh P-51D with less than 10 hours on the airframe. O'Reilly walked him over to it and showed him the guns. All 6 had been test-fired that morning. All 6 were perfect. Dalton climbed into the cockpit and sat there for a while, just feeling the weight of the machine around him. The new Mustang smelled like fresh paint and oil, nothing like the worn-in fighter he had been flying for months. But the guns were the same. 6 Browning M2s, synchronized and deadly, capable of tearing an enemy fighter apart in seconds. He thought about Werner Hoffmann, the German ace he had read about in an intelligence report. 23 kills, all of them bombers. Hoffmann had been shot down over Brandenburg in late March, his Messerschmitt destroyed by a Mustang in a head-on pass. The report didn't say who had killed him, but Dalton wondered if it might have been someone from his own group. He wondered if Hoffmann had seen the tracers coming, if he had understood in that final moment that the war had changed and that all his experience meant nothing against a machine like the Mustang. Dalton climbed out of the cockpit and walked back to the barracks. Callahan was there, cleaning his boots and talking about the next mission. They were going back to Germany tomorrow, escorting bombers to a synthetic oil plant near Leipzig. The Luftwaffe would be waiting. They always were. But so would the Mustangs, with their long range and their 6 deadly guns. Dalton sat down on his bunk and closed his eyes, trying to rest before the briefing. In his mind, he could still see the Focke-Wulf coming apart, pieces of it spinning away into the cold blue sky. He could still hear the thunder of the guns, the sound that had become the soundtrack to his war. The numbers painted a grim picture for the Luftwaffe. In January 1944, German fighter production reached an all-time high, with over 1,000 aircraft rolling off assembly lines each month. But by April, the attrition rate had become unsustainable. American fighters, primarily Mustangs, were shooting down German planes faster than they could be replaced. The 8th Air Force recorded 1,200 confirmed kills in March alone, and the real number was likely higher. Every mission cost the Germans pilots they could not afford to lose, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience who fell to American guns in the span of a few seconds. Dalton flew his 20th mission in mid-April, another deep penetration raid into central Germany. The target was an aircraft factory near Stuttgart, and the weather was perfect, clear skies and unlimited visibility. The bomber formation stretched for miles, a river of silver shapes glinting in the sunlight, and the Mustang escorts spread out above and around them like a protective shell. Dalton flew at 28,000 feet, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of enemy fighters. They came out of the west, a large formation of Messerschmitt 109s, climbing hard to meet the bombers before they reached the target. Dalton counted at least 30 of them, maybe more, and he called out their position over the radio. The escort groups turned to intercept, and within seconds the sky erupted into a chaotic tangle of contrails and tracer fire. Dalton dove into the fight, picking out a lone Messerschmitt that had broken from the formation. The German pilot saw him coming and rolled inverted, trying to dive away, but the Mustang was faster. Dalton followed him down, closing the range, and fired a short burst at 300 yards. The rounds hit the Messerschmitt's left wing, and he saw pieces of the aileron tear away. The German fighter snapped into a spin, out of control, and Dalton pulled up before he followed it down. 2 more Messerschmitts came at him from above, working together, trying to sandwich him between their fire. Dalton pulled hard to the right, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and one of the Germans overshot. He reversed the turn and came around behind the second fighter, his gun sight tracking the target as it tried to evade. He fired. The Brownings hammered, and the Messerschmitt's engine exploded in a shower of flames and debris. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue sky. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes, but when it was over, the bomber formation was intact and at least a dozen German fighters had been shot down. Dalton regrouped with his flight and counted heads. Everyone was accounted for. They climbed back to altitude and continued the escort, watching as the bombers unloaded over the target and turned for home. On the way back, they passed over the wreckage of the air battle, tiny specks on the ground that had once been aircraft and men. Dalton didn't look down. By May, the pace of operations had become relentless. The 8th Air Force was flying missions almost every day, hitting targets across Germany and occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe was still fighting, but their numbers were dwindling. Fuel shortages grounded entire squadrons. Replacement pilots arrived at the front with minimal training, some with less than 50 hours of flight time. They were no match for the veteran American pilots flying Mustangs, and they died in droves. Dalton's kill count reached double digits. He didn't celebrate. Each victory felt hollow, a necessary act of survival rather than an achievement to be proud of. He saw the faces of the German pilots sometimes, brief glimpses through the canopy glass as they passed in combat. They were young, scared, desperate. Just like him. The only difference was that he was flying a better aircraft, and he had lived long enough to learn how to use it. The intelligence briefings began to change in tone. The analysts spoke less about German capabilities and more about their collapse. Entire fighter wings had been pulled back to defend the homeland, leaving the front lines exposed. The jet fighters, the Me-262s, were appearing more frequently, but they were too few and too late to change the outcome. The Mustangs hunted them on the ground, destroying them before they could take off, and when they did manage to get airborne, they burned through their fuel so quickly that they could only stay in the fight for minutes at a time. In early May, Dalton led a mission to Berlin. It was his 30th, a milestone that most pilots never reached. The bombers hit their targets without interference, and the Mustangs returned to Bodny without firing a shot. The absence of enemy fighters was more unnerving than their presence. It meant the Luftwaffe was finished, broken beyond repair. The war in Europe was coming to an end, and everyone knew it. On May 7th, Germany surrendered. Dalton was in the air when the news came over the radio, escorting a final mission that would never reach its target. The bombers turned back, their bomb bays still full, and the Mustangs followed them home. The ground crews were waiting when they landed, cheering and waving bottles of champagne. Someone had painted a victory flag on the side of the operations building. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits and stood in a loose circle, unsure of what to say or how to feel. The war was over, but the weight of it lingered. Dalton walked away from the celebration and found a quiet spot near the edge of the airfield. He sat down in the grass and looked up at the sky, empty now of bombers and fighters and flak. He thought about all the missions, all the kills, all the pilots who hadn't made it home. He thought about the Mustang and its 6 guns, the weapon that had changed everything. The Germans had never expected it. They had never imagined that a single-engine fighter could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, or that its firepower could slice through their formations like a blade through paper. But the real weapon, Dalton realized, wasn't the guns. It was the men who flew the missions, day after day, knowing that each one might be their last. It was the ground crews who kept the fighters flying, the armorers who loaded the ammunition, the mechanics who patched the bullet holes. It was the system, the industrial might of a nation that could build thousands of Mustangs and train thousands of pilots and send them into battle with everything they needed to win. The Germans had fought with courage and skill, but in the end, they had been overwhelmed. Not by superior tactics or better pilots, but by sheer relentless pressure. The Mustangs had been the spear point of that pressure, a visible symbol of American air power that could not be stopped or turned back. And when the guns opened fire, they didn't just destroy aircraft. They destroyed hope. The weight of victory arrived slowly, settling over the squadron like frost on morning glass. Dalton noticed it first in the faces of the ground crews who no longer rushed to patch bullet holes or reload ammunition belts. The urgency had drained away, replaced by a strange emptiness that no one knew how to fill. The Mustangs sat on the flight line, their guns silent, their propellers still. O'Reilly spent his days polishing the cowlings and checking engines that no longer needed to be flight-ready. When Dalton asked him why, the sergeant just shrugged and said it felt wrong to let them sit idle after everything they had been through. The other pilots struggled in different ways. Callahan drank too much and talked too little, sitting alone in the officers' club with his eyes fixed on nothing. 2 men from another flight requested transfers stateside, citing exhaustion and nerves. The flight surgeon signed off without argument. Everyone understood. The war had asked too much for too long, and now that it was over, the bill was coming due. Dalton tried to keep busy, filling out after-action reports and attending debriefings that no longer mattered. But at night, when the base fell quiet, he found himself walking out to the flight line just to stand near his Mustang, as if proximity to the machine might anchor him to something solid. The intelligence officers began compiling final statistics in preparation for the historical record. The numbers were staggering. From January to May 1945, the 8th Air Force had flown over 90,000 sorties, dropping more than 200,000 tons of bombs on targets across Germany. The Mustang groups had escorted nearly every major mission, logging tens of thousands of flight hours and claiming over 5,000 confirmed kills. The cost had been high. More than 2,000 American fighters had been lost, along with the pilots who flew them. But the Luftwaffe had been destroyed completely, their once proud fighter wings reduced to scattered remnants hiding in barns and forests, waiting for a war that was already over. Dalton read through the reports in the operations building, tracing the arc of the air campaign from its uncertain beginnings to its overwhelming conclusion. The P-51 had been the difference, the tool that turned strategic bombing from a gamble into a certainty. Its range allowed it to go wherever the bombers went. Its speed let it engage and disengage on its own terms. And its firepower, those 6 Browning machine guns, had proven devastatingly effective against an enemy that had never adapted to the threat. German pilots who had survived years of combat against Spitfires and Hurricanes found themselves outmatched by an American fighter that could do everything better. But the real story, Dalton realized, wasn't in the numbers or the tactics. It was in the way the Mustang had changed the psychology of the air war. German pilots who took off knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned began to hesitate, to break off attacks too early, to conserve fuel instead of pressing home their runs. The fear of the Mustang's guns became as effective as the guns themselves. Gun camera footage from the final weeks of the war showed German fighters turning away as soon as they spotted the distinctive silhouette of a P-51, unwilling to risk engagement even when they had altitude advantage. The Luftwaffe hadn't just been defeated. It had been demoralized. In late May, Dalton received orders to ferry his Mustang to a collection point in France where it would be prepared for shipment back to the States. He flew alone, following a route that took him over battlefields he had seen from 25,000 feet but never from the ground. The landscape was scarred and broken, entire towns reduced to rubble, fields cratered by bombs and artillery. He landed at a temporary airfield outside Paris and watched as ground crews tagged his aircraft with a destination code. They told him it would probably end up in a scrapyard, melted down for raw materials. The thought made him sick. He spent 2 days in Paris waiting for transport orders, wandering the streets and trying to make sense of a city that had moved on from the war while he was still trapped in it. The cafes were full, the markets crowded, people laughing and arguing and living as if the last 5 years had been nothing more than a bad dream. Dalton sat at a small table near the Seine and watched the river flow past, thinking about all the things he had seen and done and could never speak about. A French woman at the next table smiled at him and raised her glass in a silent toast. He nodded but didn't return the smile. He wasn't ready to celebrate. When he finally boarded the transport ship at Le Havre, Dalton stood on the deck and watched the French coast disappear into the haze. Somewhere behind him, scattered across England and France and Germany, were the wrecks of hundreds of aircraft, the graves of thousands of men. The Mustangs that had survived would be mothballed or scrapped, their guns removed and their engines salvaged. In a few years, people would forget what they had done, how they had turned the tide of the air war and broken the back of the Luftwaffe. But Dalton would remember. He would carry it with him for the rest of his life, the sound of the guns, the sight of enemy fighters disintegrating under fire, the weight of survival when so many others had fallen. The journey home took 2 weeks, the ship plowing through gray Atlantic swells while Dalton and the other returning pilots tried to adjust to the idea of peacetime. Some played cards. Others wrote letters. Dalton spent most of his time on deck, staring at the horizon and thinking about what came next. He had no job waiting for him, no plan beyond getting back to Iowa and trying to pick up the pieces of a life he had left behind 3 years ago. The farm would still be there, assuming his father had managed to keep it running. But Dalton wasn't sure he could go back to that world, to the slow rhythm of planting and harvest, after everything he had experienced. When the ship docked in New York, the city erupted in celebration. Crowds lined the piers, waving flags and cheering as the returning servicemen filed down the gangways. Dalton felt disconnected from it all, watching the spectacle as if through a pane of glass. A reporter pushed through the crowd and asked him what it felt like to be a hero. Dalton didn't answer. He just kept walking, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, trying to find a way out of the noise. He took a train west, watching the country roll past outside the window. Farmland and forests, small towns and cities, all untouched by the war that had consumed Europe. It was beautiful and alien at the same time, a world that had continued on while he had been fighting and killing and trying not to die. By the time he reached Iowa, Dalton was exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of everything he couldn't say. His father met him at the station, older and grayer than Dalton remembered, and they drove home in silence. The farm looked exactly as he had left it. Same barn, same fields, same windmill turning slowly in the summer breeze. Dalton stood in the yard and felt nothing. His mother came out of the house and hugged him, and he held her and tried to pretend that he was the same person who had left 3 years ago. But he wasn't. He had flown 30 missions over Germany. He had shot down 12 enemy fighters. He had seen men die in ways that would haunt him forever. And he had come home to a place that didn't understand and couldn't heal him. That night, lying in his old bed, Dalton closed his eyes and saw the Mustang's guns opening fire, the tracers arcing through the sky, the enemy fighters breaking apart under the weight of American steel. He heard the thunder of the Brownings, felt the shudder of the airframe as the guns emptied their belts. The war was over, but it lived inside him still, a permanent part of who he was. The P-51 Mustang had changed the war. But the war had changed him in ways that no victory could undo. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.